Hey ballerinos, welcome back to Reformation Rambles. You might notice to the side here, little wee microphone that I've been able to fund thanks to my lovely patrons. Fingers crossed I've worked out how to use it properly and this has better sound than usual. But it's so exciting to me, like I've always just had to go off of a camera's microphone and generally they're not the best. So thank you so much to my Patreons for this. So happy. Welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series where I tell you all about the history of the European Reformation. With that in mind, it may seem a little bit weird that this video is about the Sultan of an empire that wasn't technically counted as Europe at the time. We have mentioned the Ottoman Empire so much in these videos. I think it's really important that we learn about the empire and the leader of that empire in the 16th century. With that in mind, today we will be learning about the 10th and longest reigning Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He ruled over 25 million people from 1520 to 1566. Suleiman the Lawgiver, or Suleiman the Magnificent, born to Selim I and Hafsa in 1494. Part 1. Wives and kids. Suleiman married Hurrem Sultan, who had been captured in Crimea and sold as a slave in Constantinople, which is grim. There's no way around it, it's grim. He'd essentially moved through the ranks of Suleiman's harem, become his wife. In Europe she was often referred to as Oxlina because she had red hair. And based on Suleiman's own poetry, he adored this woman. Here's an excerpt from one of his poems about her. My plants, my sweet, my rose, the one only who does not distress me in this room. So yeah, either he really loved her or he really hated everyone else. Of the 17 women in his harem, the only other one that's mentioned a lot is Mahidran Hatun, but he never married her. He'd have 13 children with both of these women, and a lot of those children would die. Now see if you can spot a theme here. His son Mehmed died of smallpox. His son Mustafa strangled to death on the Sultan's orders. Baghdad was executed by the Sultan after a rebellion. You get the gist. He didn't kill all his kids, but I think this evidences that keeping power meant more to him than family ties. So part 2. Lawgiver. Suleiman got his nickname the Lawgiver due to extensive reform that would harmonise Sultan law or Qanun and religious law or Sharia. It's important to note that it looks like the name Lawgiver emerged in the 18th century and didn't exist in his lifetime. But I think that shows how major these reforms were. Suleiman has no control over Sharia law. That is essentially a religious code of conduct. But Qanun laws was his wheelhouse. That's what he controlled. This covered criminal law, land tenure and taxation. So he collected every law or judgment that had been issued by the 9 previous sultans. He's only the 10th. Wild times. He got rid of any duplicates and he decided between any that opposed each other, that said the exact opposite, and issued one conclusive legal code. He also reformed the law as his empire changed. His legal code would last more than 300 years. The impact of that is just undeniable. So a few examples of the laws he put in 1553 or 1554, we're not certain. He put protections for his Jewish subjects into law. So if we compare that to a lot of Europe at the time, this is incredibly progressive by comparison. More specifically, he issued a firman formally denouncing blood libel against Jews. He also enacted new criminal police legislation and set fines for specific offences that largely reduced the number of offences that would lead to you being killed or maimed, having body parts cut off. It was much less violent by comparison. There were still things you could do that would lead to those things, but substantially less than there had been beforehand. He had taxes levied on various products, and then he set up education centres. These were usually one building in amongst mosques, libraries, baths, soup kitchens, hospitals, basically just places for public benefit. And it became standardised that anyone educated to university level would become a teacher. I wish a degree guaranteed work like that now. important to note that Suleiman had a lot of people working for him. Like most rulers of the time, these changes weren't just him, but a whole team of people. As a team, they allowed these advancements to take place, and whilst Suleiman had the final say, he didn't necessarily come up with all these ideas. From 1540 to 41, he made a lot of these admin and legal reforms, and people all across the world would acknowledge how well run the empire was. Quote, strong agricultural base of the country, the well-being of the peasants, the abundance of staple foods, of the preeminence of organisation in Suleiman's government. And in Europe, we often imply that non-European countries were behind us in some way, and this kind of evidences that just isn't true. The Ottoman Empire in many ways was ahead of 16th century Europe. Part 3. Supporter of the arts. Now, Suleiman was a poet and a goldsmith, so it's not super surprising that he oversaw a golden age of artistic, literary and architectural development. He set up hundreds of imperial societies called el-Hiref. These were like artistic societies. Actually, after an apprenticeship in their craft, people would move through the ranks within their specific field to the highest rank of artistic master. Artists were paid quarterly, and Suleiman would personally inspect artists' work and reward them for outstanding work. Imagine a leader of a country doing that today. Or even just caring a bit about the arts, that'd be nice. 1526, there were 40 of these societies, with over 600 members, and they attracted the empire's most talented artists to the imperial courts. These would be people from Islamic regions, as well as people from newly conquered European places. This led to a really interesting artistic blend of Arabic, Turkish and European influences. This led to the origination of cirque, a tree style art. I'll put a photo up. And a naturalistic style. Not an art buff, soz. I'm sure there are better ways to explain this. Yeah, this naturalistic style of painting starts to be favoured. Now, Suleiman developed an artistic legacy for the Ottoman Empire, but kind of like Isabella of Castile, who we spoke about last week, he commissioned a lot of literary works praising his own rule, and sort of presenting him as this ideal ruler. So we need to remember that, but under his rule, some incredible architecture was built. In 1544, the Khusrawi Mosque in Aleppo was constructed, and from 1550 to 1557, the Suleimanif Mosque in Istanbul was built. Part 4. A growing empire. Under Suleiman's rule, the Ottoman Empire reached the peak of its economic, military and political power. He annexed a lot of the Middle East, large parts of North Africa, going as far west as Algeria, put a map up, and some of Europe. The Ottoman naval fleet in this time dominated the Mediterranean, as well as the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. He began military conquests as soon as he came to power. In 1521, he started to prepare to conquer Belgrade and take it from Hungary. His great-granddad Mehmed II had already failed to do this in the past. There's history behind this decision that we're talking about that is now history. Good. Hungary at the time was basically the only force preventing Ottoman gains in Europe, so they circled Belgrade and began a series of attacks from an island in the middle of the Danube River. Belgrade only had 700 men, and they got no real support from Hungary, and they fell in 1521. And Marmaris Castle was built. This was a fort for Ottoman forces, and they would use intense naval power that we already mentioned to siege Rhodes in 1522. Siege would go on for 5 months, and they'd lose 50 to 60,000 men, some to battle, some to sickness. Some Christian countries would claim they lost 50,000 to battle and 64,000 to sickness. But we generally think that's just propaganda now. We don't think they lost that many forces. They still lost an obscene amount, that's still a lot of lives. But it was inflated by European countries. They re-invaded later in the year, and Rhodes would fall in late 1522, early 1523. It's hazy when it counts, right? The articles I read varied on the date, but this bit definitely happened. The Knights The Knights Hospitalier, who they'd been fighting in Rhodes, had to just leave and go to Crete safely. Suleiman said he respected their bravery. In 1526, Suleiman would beat Louis II of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs. Louis actually died, and Suleiman reportedly said, "It was not my wish that he should be thus cut off. He scarcely tasted the sweets of life and royalty." Hungarian nobles then proposed that they make the guy running, like, Austria, which was next door, the king of Hungary now, and that would be Ferdinand. You may remember him as Charles V's brother from this video. All linked, lads, it's all linked. Suleiman supported a nobleman called Zone Zapolya. And so did quite a lot of other nobles, it wasn't like just him, and so he was put in charge. Eventually the Habsburgs, led by Charles V, reoccupied Hungary by taking over Buda. Or Buda? Hungarians, let me know. Suleiman would try to siege Vienna and fail. Suleiman would try and conquer Vienna again in 1532 and failed, partly due to a siege elsewhere that sort of took a load of his men away. It also meant they left behind some like essential equipment, but also bad weather. Oh, I feel like in history no one ever accounts for weather when they're invading places. Like, you've got all the stories of people forgetting that Russia has winter, and this seems like that sort of thing again. Like, surely you know what the weather's going to be. I never planned an invasion, but I feel like he'd know what the weather was going to be. In 1529, Suleiman marched through the valley of the Danube and reclaimed Buda later that same year. In 1541, the Habsburgs would fail to siege Buda. In the end, Ferdinand and Charles were forced to sign a humiliating 5-year treaty with Suleiman. Ferdinand had to renounce his claim to the throne and pay a yearly fee to Suleiman for the lands that he was keeping. And instead of calling Charles Emperor, he was called King of Spain. Sounds super minor, not because technically he was the King of Spain, he was both those things. But it's believed this was like a snub. The implication was that he wasn't the rightful Holy Roman Emperor, but we can't really be sure about that. You know what I mean? This Habsburg-Ottoman rivalry would last into the 20th century. They really knew how to hold a grudge. Now, Suleiman's predecessor Selim I had prioritised war with the Persians over Europe. Suleiman would get to that. But he stabilised his position in Europe first. Persia was the base of like a rival Islamic faction led by the Safavid dynasty. The Shah of Iran, Vamps, but I think is how you pronounce the name. I'm not certain. I couldn't find anyone that said it out loud, so I'm going to put it on the screen. Essentially gave up his territory in 1534. Avoid a battle with Suleiman's troops, which, big mood, I too avoid confrontation. In 1535, Suleiman made a grand entrance into Baghdad to restore the tomb of Abu Hanifa, founded the Hanifa school of Islam, which the Ottoman Empire followed. This was the branch of Islam that they followed, and Persia didn't, so it was kind of them like insulting them in a roundabout way. There was also a second campaign to take over Persia, about 1548 to 1549, in which the Shah sort of strategically retreated to expose the Ottoman troops. Really harsh winters in the Caucasus region. All of these conquerors, and not one of them remembers that winter exists. Winter won every war in history, look it up. And with this, Suleiman made temporary gains in and Urmia gained lasting control. Camera this should be fun. The Ottomans kept most of Iraq, including Baghdad, whilst the Persians kept Tabrik, Caucasus and Azerbaijan. There were a lot more battles that the Ottomans had and attempts to conquer smaller places, and honestly could make a whole video just on that. Like, I'd have to read more, but I could make a whole video just on that. And I feel like I say this in every video, but I don't want people to misinterpret me. I don't think it's good that these powers just took over countries when we won a war, so it's mine now. But I also don't think it's wise to shy away from darker parts of history, otherwise we never learn from them. The Ottomans' military power was so immense under Suleiman's role that Austria's ambassador at the time warned that the entirety of Europe would imminently be conquered by them. Now, leaders after Solomon would be urged to be more like him, and a lot of European scholars claimed there was a significant decline after his death. But, plot twist, there might not have been. The decline writers might just have been writing in an organised style, in a recognised style, rather than lamenting the golden age was over. The style just didn't exist in Europe, and so people in Europe would misunderstand it. Cultural context is everything. Overall, Suleiman had a truly achievement-filled rule, and changed the future of the Ottoman Empire forever. I really hope you enjoyed this. If you did, give me a cheeky like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if I touched on anything you'd like to know more about. And I'll see you next week. Bye! Thanks for click-clacking.